Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to yet another edition of the Aftermarket Champions podcast. This is Vivek Joshi, your host. I'm the CEO and founder of Entitled, a software as a service company that serves original equipment manufacturers. My guest today is John Weiner, former CEO of Hayward Gordon, one of our customers, and now John is a personal friend of mine. He too lives here in Austin like me, and I thought it'd be great to have him come in and join us as a guest to tell us a little bit about his story, about his experiences leading up to Hayward Gordon, but more importantly, the role of aftermarket in the context of Hayward Gordon and his career, because he's had quite an illustrious career to this date. So, with that, welcome, John. Welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, Vivek. Good to see you as well.
So, John, I always like to start this show with asking people to tell a little bit about themselves, a little bit about John. So maybe your history all the way from Brooklyn onwards, or you choose where you want to start, right?
Well, just celebrated my 60th birthday last month, so they can get an idea.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. But I went to University of Denver, graduated in the mid '80s, and then eventually went final education at the Harvard Business School at the Advanced Management Program, which was a great way to kind of cap off my education. Spent 26 years in corporate America, a company called Paul Corporation. Paul is the world leader of filtration, industrial filtration, and life sciences. I was on the industrial side, and for 26 years, worked with some of the best and brightest people I've ever met. I'm very fortunate to have that career. And during that time, I spent a total of 12 years living and working in Asia. First in the early 90s, then in the from 2004 through 2011. Lived in Singapore, lived in Japan, and was able to eventually, I ran the industrial businesses throughout Asia. That's 13 countries and about $500 million of sales. After 26 years, I think it was time for something new, and wound up working with Baird Capital out of Chicago, running one of their, and eventually two of their portfolio companies, a company called Kason. And I moved from membrane filtration and consumables in that respect to capital equipment, which was a small part of Paul's business. We definitely had the approach. We sold equipment to sell filters, and so it's definitely the idea was to get as many filters as you could sell. It's interesting when you get to Kason, they're a capital equipment, and they really didn't focus on aftermarket at all because it's rotary equipment, and it's just about selling hundreds of thousands of dollars. Each piece of equipment being, $100,000, right? Ran that for 4 years. That was sold, moved to Element Partners, where I ran a group of companies called the Hayward Gordon Group. That's Hayward Gordon Pumps and Mixers, Sharp Mixer, and Scott Turbine. And there again, capital equipment, but there's a great portion of aftermarket that unfortunately was not being mined correctly. And we just sold that a year ago to Ibarra Corporation, the world's largest pump company. Great exit. Everyone was very happy. And I've just entered retirement, but still keeping my hand in the private equity world.
Yes, and I think that's been a fantastic story for you, just listening to this 26 years at Paul, but also this 12 years in the Asian market. I mean, 13 countries, so lots of frequent flyer miles.
Yeah.
But I think the point is that in those 12 years, you probably saw lots of similarities and differences in the way those markets treat capital equipment in the post-sales environment, in your case, filters, versus maybe the US and European markets. Is there something there that was unique in terms of Asia versus US that you took away?
Yeah. Well, Paul Corporation is not really a capital equipment company, so it is a consumer business. So I grew up thinking, it's about long, relationships, but Americans and New Yorkers are very transactional and are very kind of go on to the next item. In Asia, when I got to Japan, I was 26 years old. I knew everything, so I thought. And the Japanese, it's a completely different world. It's long-term relationships. The customer is king. You do everything you can do to make that customer happy. And so the Japanese really taught me about that stickiness with relationships, about going the extra mile, and then maybe even a little bit beyond that. Customer complaints were taken with the utmost seriousness. If a customer is down, their business stops, our world stops. And I think that's true of a lot of Asia. So Japan certainly exemplifies it, but through India and Singapore, Korea, and those countries, quality is key, making the customer happy, and establishing those really long-term decisions. The other thing was lucky is that Nepal was a very big company, 12,000 employees.
Wow.
Asia had I had about 1,800 with the factories, but there were 13 countries. So when you looked at it outside of Japan, they were really small businesses. You had to be quick, you had to be nimble. You weren't dealing with matrix organizations like you would at the mothership in New York. And so I was able to work in a big organization, but have the feel of running a small company.
But there's something interesting you said in addition to the small company bit at the end. You talked about the relationships, the continuity, the stickiness, and the ability to kind of be making sure you're always taking the customer's outcome as a first thing. Now, when you translate that to your experience, not just at Kson, but really at the Hayward Gordon companies, how did that manifest itself and how you started making changes, what kinds of things you started doing? Because that to me is really a secret sauce. I think a lot of companies forget that the
Yeah.
ability to tie together long-term relationships, right?
Yeah. Well, capital equipment, if you're selling pumps, let's say, and you get $1 million worth of pumps for a municipality, when are they going to come back and be your customer again? 10 years, 20? The pumps last certainly that long. So unless there's an expansion or something, tragic happens, they're not your customer. So your salespeople are looking to move on to the next big elephant to kill. But the aftermarket is the best opportunity. So you
Yeah.
need to kind of start figuring out how do you stay with that customer. One is obviously making sure your quality is better than anyone else, because you don't want to spend your time fixing problems that you didn't have to create in the first place.
Right.
But beside that, what we really learned, I think, at Hayward Gordon is you can't ask salespeople to be what they're not, which is aftermarket salespeople. Elephant hunters need to hunt elephants, and farmers need to farm.
Yep.
And so we decided, let's create a separate sales organization outside of the capital guys and hand off the business. In fact, I'd say it even started before the sale. We looked at our quote system and said, why aren't we quoting the aftermarket parts, a set of them,
Up
with the
front.
initial, right? And you say, well, why do I need parts? And we'd explain to the customer it's good to have them in case something happens. Maybe you
Right.
break something. And we would give them a package deal. But we wanted to get our part number in their system.
Right.
So that
Right.
when someone in purchasing a year from now says,
Right.
a seal for a Hayward Gordon, boom, they got the part number. So it started there. Then once you got the order, the day of really installation, one of the checklists is an introduction to the customer to the aftermarket team, whoever's got that customer. So you had to make that connection, right? I'm leaving. Thank you for your sale. Here's Dave. He's going to take care of the aftermarket. And we would actually have scheduled 30-day, 90, 6-month, and 1-year follow-ups.
Fascinating.
Right. So this way, you got an email and a call just following up. How's everything going? Well, the customer
Right.
will tell you. And
Right.
if it's not, you want to know that. And if it's great,
Right.
you want to know that too.
Right.
And there was an opportunity for, have you serviced it? There's a certain amount of lubrication that needs to go on, and do you need
Right.
seals? And how is it? We also tried to sell monitoring, and that was some success. I think it's going to get better now with the Internet of Things. But the idea is, hey, why don't I monitor your equipment? I'll tell you when you need something. And I think that's the future. And the last part is looking back at Hayward Gordon was a 70-year-old company. Sharp and Scott Turbin were 50-year companies. The next question was, how do we go after that treasure trove, that mine of gold, which is an established base of customer? It's been out 20, 30 years. It does need aftermarket and regular service. How do I get that? Because if I'm not selling it to you and I sold you the equipment 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years,
Somebody else is there.
somebody's eting my lunch. So we really kind of had to look at the whole process from new equipment and creating that opportunity that goes forward. How do we create new opportunities like with monitoring? Truthfully, the biggest opportunity is that mine of 30 to 40-year-old equipment. And how do I get that going forward? So it's a multifaceted approach, and one which I think that Entitle really helped us unlock.
But I appreciate that last part, but I think to go back to something you said, which is interesting, right? So at the point of sale, once the sale and installation is done, your capital equipment salesperson hand off, your aftermarket manager or team leader, whoever it could be, saying, my job is done. You got your pump up and running. By the way, here's John Weiner, who's now going to take care of you over the next few months, years, whatever it might be. That's an interesting handoff. I've not seen too many people put that into practice on that kind of handoff basis. Is that something you took from Paul, or is that something you guys developed in your own, or was that an existing practice? Because that's actually a really good practice in my mind.
Yeah, I think I got it. Truthfully, Paul was more always like less capital, so it was more.
Sure.
I think the idea originally, and probably wasn't even from me. I have to tell you, I've had some great people who worked for me and who I've
Yeah.
worked for. So I'll take credit for this conversation, but likely I'm lying. But we talked about how car dealerships do it. When you sell a
Right.
car, when you
Right.
buy a car, and the salesman's with you the whole time, and you agree on a price, and he walks you over for the paperwork, and then they're going to sell you, of course, the undercoating and all the horrible things you
Yep.
want to argue. But he's walked away because they want him back in the front of the showroom for the next customer to walk in,
Yep.
and actually for the life of your car, it'll be that service guy,
Yep.
and it's a very effective way because you don't want the guy who's selling you the car trying to sell you on a tire replacement program.
Yep.
So,
Yep. No,
so
I
I
think that's a
think
great
it
practice, though.
comes from
Really
there.
good practice.
Right. And,
Uh,
and I've seen it done from some other companies, and it really is a best in class process.
yeah.
So not invented by me, but certainly stolen shamelessly by me.
Yeah. There's something else you said in the Japan experience talking about relationships and continuity and stuff. So it's one thing to hand off to John Doe, who's now your aftermarket manager. The question is, how do you go about making sure that organizationally and institutionally is John Doe and Jane Smith and whoever else follows this customer or set of customers have a certain cadence and rhythm to go. You talked about emails and phone calls every 30, 60, 90 days, or whatever it could be.
Yep.
But just going beyond that, embedding that mindset in the company is also important. How do you go about doing that in a company as old? And, honestly, with age or tenure comes practices that are embedded in your brain, right?
Yeah,
That
well, I
change
think
hard.
one of it is we really bifurcated the two things very clearly within the company. So you've had a sales manager for capital equipment, and we had a sales manager for aftermarket.
Yep.
And first of all, as I told you, the aftermarket is the gravy; it's the high margin. So
Yep.
capital equipment, 25% margins might be really good.
Yep.
Aftermarket, 50 and 75 is really good.
Yep.
So every dollar I sell in aftermarket is worth three times in some cases with the capital. It needs to be elevated to the same status as the capital equipment. And in fact, you're trying to get to at least 25 or 30% of your total revenue to be aftermarket. And if
Right.
it's 30% of your revenue, that means it's almost equal in profit to your capital, right? So there really should be equally weighted. The sales team, of course, always has sales commissions, and so does the aftermarket team. So
Yep.
incentivizing these people for those sales is very important. And yes, you can automate emails. You can automate. We did promotions, so that first sale is the most important.
Yep.
Getting your SKU number in their system is so important. So we don't just do a package of, let's say, aftermarket parts. We had everything enumerated, so we could
Yeah.
get each of those into the system, and then people were incentivized, paid for quarterly for the aftermarket sales.
It's a
But
bit of a
just the
Trojan
manager
horse.
doing it, I think, is important
Yeah.
to show the seriousness of the company.
Yeah. And I like this part number idea because that's also a Trojan horse, right? The moment you're in the system, you're an AVL, it automatically just becomes like it just plays a PO. You have the part number in your system anyway.
Well, it's funny.
Now,
Caisson Corporate.
yeah.
On that point, one of the biggest consumables in Caisson is vibratory screeners. Have screens, big round screens, some 102-inch diameter, could cost $20,000, but smaller ones are $500-600. They break, they have to be replaced, have to have different sizes for different jobs. And they didn't have a part numbering system for the screens because there's a lot of variables: the size, the mesh, the gasket, does it have a center plate?
Material, whatever it might
And
be.
the
Yeah.
answer is, of course, you can create a part number. It's
Right.
not that hard to do, and we did. And but the shame was customers could never order a part number,
Right.
and
Right.
and so you made it difficult for the customer to order, and that's the last thing you want to be is the hindrance, not the help to the customer.
Right. There's a couple of things I want to pick up on. One is you talked about this part number idea, which is great. But something that you just referred to has been stuck in my mind for a while, which is as you make these things happen, there's a series of changes that happen, right? So you had to convince the case on people to say, look, let's create part numbers for every one of these meshes. Or you create this practice about having everything tabulated correctly to kind of
Right.
have the part numbers, put them in system. But that begs a bigger question, John, about change management, right? Again, I don't know how old Kaysen was as an entity, but my guess is more than 40, 50 years old. Hayward Gordon, 70 years old. How much change management did you have to undertake to kind of make this thing work for you, right? Because it's not simple. And that's where I see the biggest failure mode, if you may, in most of these companies today.
Sure. And depending on the size of the company, the first mistake I think people make, Paul Corporation, by the way, was a wonderful place to practice change management. It was highly innovative. It's owned now by Danaher, which, as you know,
Yep.
Danaher Business Systems. I mean, there's a
Master.
process. Yeah,
Yep.
I think Paul was very similar in that we had really kind of figured out how we do things, and change is necessary for every business. The first thing, though, with small companies is you can come up with 1,000 great ideas, but if there's only 10 people to do it, you're not doing 1,000 ideas. You really have to pick your battles. So
Yep.
don't
Yep.
do more than you can do.
Yep.
Uh, in the first few, so we used to do product champions. We used to do, we would make it very special. If you were on a team, we elevate that in the eyes of the employees. So you almost wanted to, hey, can I get on an initiative? They were different initiative teams. We would name them.
Right.
We had a team at Hayward Gordon. We had the Midas team. We had the Marigold team, and they had very specific goals. You were chosen to be part of it. We did special things, dinners, and so on. There were weekly and monthly report outs. And so if you're a lower level person on this team, you felt kind of special. We did, when we finished projects, we gave prizes, we gave gifts. Everyone had pens and T-shirts that had Team Marigold and this and that. So you really want to create an excitement around the initiative. But it has to be a very clear start and finish. You have to set the goals. You have to manage it. And you make these people feel as if it matters, that they're
You know,
changing the company.
it's a big deal to make people feel special. It's a big deal to get them motivated to do these things right. And I think that's an important aspect. Now, one question for you regarding that, and it goes back to what you said a little while ago, which is it's one thing to have a Paul with 12,000 people and Kaysan with whatever the size was, and coming to Hayward Gordon, where maybe you don't have the size of employees that population, if you may.
Yeah.
And therefore, finding even the 10 people to do it is always hard in these smaller companies, right?
Right.
Did you have to go back and maybe reskill certain things or maybe bring in people from the outside? How do you kind of make some of these things stick there?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, if you don't have the skill set in house, you've got to go out and get it. There are people, though, that are really interested in learning new skills and getting upgraded. So, project management, for example, on one gentleman he was naturally good at it, but he was totally unskilled, and also we didn't have the right software. So sent him off for like a month, I think it was a 4-week course. Came back as energized as you could find someone. So investing in your people is a great step. A lot of the young people want to learn new stuff,
Yeah.
but there are also, you'd be surprised the guy, the 25-year veteran in the company who's just done it, and you kind of look at him and gets up, does the same thing every day. He might be looking for a challenge too. So I think you got to keep the door open for everybody.
A couple of questions. I want to rewind to your early day, not early days, but when you came to Hayward Gordon. A couple of questions for you. One is, how did you wind up in the Hayward Gordon job? Was it because you did have a relationship with Element Partners, or were you selected to kind of, recruited from the outside coming in?
Yeah, it was a recruiter. It was one of the large, recruiters. It was Hydrix and Struggles, and they came to
Yeah.
me. I'll tell you, my fortunate has been that I like long-term relationships. I make friends, and Vivek, I count you obviously as one of those. Making sure you make an effort to keep friendships in business or in personal life, I think, are an important sign of happiness. And with Hydrix and Struggles, they had come to me several times with possible job opportunities, and I said, not interested, but I know somebody who would be great for it. And on 2 occasions, ex-colleagues of mine were fortunate enough. I threw their name into the ring, and they got the job. Now, they're certainly thankful.
All right.
But who is also the Hydrix Struggles of the world are thankful.
That's right. That's right.
Their job is trying to find good candidates, and if I can hand them one, so you start breeding this back and forth until something really juicy came up. And for me, love private equity. It's the best. After doing both sides, let me tell you, thank you, corporate America. I have nothing to do with you. Private equity to me is the place to be, and we can discuss the reasons why. But and so I jump at those opportunities. In fact, I have a call later today on one of those opportunities. So it's only because of old contacts and friends that things pop up.
But it's actually interesting, right? So, and I'm going to go one more different question, but what I keep picking up from you is actually something that is a underappreciated aspect of success, which is relationships and investing them and investing network around you. To some degree, I keep looking at you and saying, John's a born sales guy, because I know I've known you for many years and I understand that. But also, if you go back to your experience in Japan, it's about creating and maintaining those relationships and cultivating them over time. not just transaction, like you said. We tend to be very transactional versus building out a what's in it for you, what's in it for me kind of process. And I think people forget that.
Right.
Now, I want to kind of segue a little bit back to the private equity and element partners discussion.
Sure.
So, my perspective on private equity is they're as focused as any, to your point, is a thank you for private equity. They're very focused. They have a deal thesis. They kind of have a objective and plan in mind, and we're going to execute that. Was that one of the motivations why they brought you in, because of the experiences you had on the what I would call razor blade, capital plus aftermarket mindset?
Yeah.
Was there a specific deal thesis that Element had as part of the Hayward Gordon investment?
The answer is yes, but I think they liked a couple of things. One is, well, private equity. The nice thing is that you walk in day one with exit on your mind, so there's an end goal, and I like that. I like having really concrete deliverables, and you need to instill that throughout the organization. It can't just be
Yeah,
like everyone understood where we were going. It's not a
yeah,
secret.
yeah.
But I had run big companies that are very good at process, very good, right? We talk about Paul or
Right,
Danaher. We talk.
right.
There is a way of doing things that big companies have figured out. Translating that to a small, what used to be a mom and pop type of company, and a lot of these smaller companies are just
Yeah,
that. Is tough to do, but you need somebody who has the skill set, as we just talked about, of getting the old way to do the new, the change management.
yeah, yeah.
When 13 countries in Asia are 13 very different.
They're in
Uh, you know,
cultures.
the best compliment I ever got was in Japan. One of my colleagues I'd known for 20 years said to me, "John, I think in your past life you were Japanese." Now, my good friend in Korea years later said to me, "John, I think you used to be Korean." Because you think like a Korean. And then later on, my good friend who ran Paul in India said, "John, I think he used to be Indian." I tend to look at most of these cultures, and that could be a country or it could be a company, and not say why are they doing this wrong, but
Right,
what can I learn from how they do right, and
right.
and really absorb the good things.
Yeah.
And once you do that, and they get the genuine feeling that you're listening and appreciating them, you can then offer suggestions.
Advice, suggestions, right?
But the ugly American, which I'm sure I've been accused of as well, of let me tell you how. Let me tell you, is probably the worst way to start any conversation.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Let me
So
tell you what you should do, right?
exactly. Everyone's eyes roll to the back of their head. Yeah.
So when you think about this journey at Hayward Gordon, you were there for like 4 or 5 years, I think, roughly plus or minus, right?
Yep.
I know. I mean, we don't need to know the data because you and I've talked about this in the past. But what is the transformation in terms of the mix of aftermarket and aftermarket really parts and consumables when you arrived versus when you left as a percentage of the total? Because I think it was a dramatically improved performance, if I remember correctly, right? Again, no
Yeah,
numbers
we were
needed, but
I think we were about 15 to 18% of aftermarket. Most of that from a very small pool. So you got to measure two things. One is percentage,
right, right,
absolutely. The other is it, yeah, you're getting all this money, but it's from one or two customers.
yeah,
A lot of it was from the mining industry, and I think the reason for that obviously is they're hyper focused
high wear
on
rates, yeah,
keeping things
yeah,
moving. There are remote locations. They buy lots of parts because if something goes down, and also it's custom equipment, so you
yeah,
can't just call up 8 different suppliers and get them.
right,
The tough part is expanding that base and on some of the more consumable things that are really pass-through items
yeah,
that you can buy and resell and still make 2 or 3 times the money
right,
because
right,
that's the very seals and gaskets,
yeah, yeah,
those type of things. And so we went from about 15 to 18, and we certainly were over 30. And that's
that's a big
again
number,
creating that stickiness with the new stuff, but that's a
right,
very slow process. And
right.
if I sell a piece of capital equipment, my first aftermarket might be a year or two down the road.
That's right, that's
If
right,
I want to get at it today, it's about mining the old customers. So
that's right,
we took the approach: anything that's between 5 and 10 years old that hasn't bought anything from us. So this is data mining and that's where companies like yours really helped us. Let's come up with a thesis. If you haven't bought anything in the 5 to 10 year window, and we know the equipment's still there because it
yeah,
doesn't last for a long time, and we know there's parts, somebody else is eating our lunch. That was our expression. I don't like that feeling. All right.
yeah,
How do I get that back? And that is okay, what parts can I go after? Who do we know at those sites? And if a salesman's in the area, can they drop by? Can we create some type of a way of doing it? Can we get the aftermarket team really going through
Focus
the
on
internet,
this.
right? And trying to find
Yeah.
using LinkedIn, using all these Salesforce. We used not Salesforce, but a different
Dynamics.
CRM. Yeah, we used
Yeah.
Dynamics. And how do we integrate all that to work? So I think that's the approach we did it, but it moved the needle. And remember, 25% margin versus 75% margin, an extra 10%, 10% from 15 to 25 to 30. The bottom line
And a
gets
much higher
gets
margin.
boost. Yeah, yeah. So
Huge
it's
leverage.
yeah, and so we saw a huge improvement on the company's overall revenue, profit, and percentage of profit compared to revenue, and that's due to aftermarket.
So interesting. You said when you entered when you entered here with Gordon and private equity, it's clear you have a focus in mind, which is an exit. You build a plan, you build the
Yeah.
profile to the exit. So you also mentioned just now that you goosed up margins, you goosed up growth. You obviously had a higher EBITDA margin, if you may, before and after. How did that play into your final exit process, I guess?
Yeah, it's the multiples. The multiples in industrial business can be. It depends. The heydays could be 10, 12, 15%.
Yeah, yeah,
It's not SaaS and it's not
yeah.
life sciences. There's no 25s and 30s.
That's right.
And in the worst side, if you have a very small customer concentration, could be 5 or 8%, 6%.
Yeah, yeah,
And then after COVID and as in obviously as interest rates have gone up, the ability for private equity to leverage has gotten harder. So multiples have come down. But without talking
no,
specifics
yeah,
about Hayward Gordon, the multiples were beyond where they had hoped, and most people want to have an IRR of 25%. They want to see
right.
a 2.5 to 3 times exit,
Yeah,
and we surpassed those numbers significantly. So that's a healthy return for all the investors. And Element Partners couldn't have been better how they treated all the employees.
yeah,
And I'll shout out to Ibarra Corporation who had bought it. They have been the best company to sell to.
yeah,
And that's something we think about. When you're selling a company, yeah, you want to get the highest number, but you don't want to sell your baby. And even the
yeah.
private equity, the heartless private equity guys, turns out they're like Grinch. They have a heart,
That's right. That's
and
right.
they really want. And it was a great exit. So both from a personal, from economic standpoint, but also from just the right people. We sold the
Satisfaction.
company to the
Yeah,
right people, and it made a
yeah.
difference. Yeah,
But it's something interesting you said. So you Element took care of the employees, but the business that you built, the profile you changed from before and after, really helped in terms of getting a better value for the company overall. Now, the question I have, and you and I have talked about this is a bit of a softball question, is since even though it's so obvious, John, of what the transformation does in terms of the value, valuation, and so on and so forth, why do more companies not follow that path
right.
of building up a strong aftermarket, post sales, parts and service, whatever you want to call it, business versus just letting things be, right?
Right.
It's a mystery to me, enduring mystery to me.
Well, of course, a lot of these companies are family owned. The capital equipment guys are typically the owners are mechanical engineers. They love their equipment.
Yeah,
It's their babies, right? They help develop
yeah,
it. That's what they want to talk about. That's what they want to sell. And if
yeah,
they're making good money, is growth really that important? Do I want to invest my hard-earned winning cash
yeah,
in something that may or may not pay off?
yeah, yeah,
And so the private equity eyes are really what are the metrics we need to go, and private equity companies are sharks. They need to keep swimming to live. Well, we need to keep growing. So revenue needs to go up, margins need to improve, cost needs to improve as well. So, I've walked into family-owned companies where we ask questions and they say, "Oh, we don't track that. Can you give us your revenue growth for the last few years?" Yeah, most people have that. We see margins by product family. We don't have
no
that.
idea what that
When was
means.
the last time we had a price increase? We only when we have to, or because pricing strategies are another thing. Do you realize you're selling this for less money than that, but that costs more? Oh, we never looked at that. We didn't look at our gross.
Yeah, yeah,
So, I
yeah,
think it's the professionalism of either a large public company, which are
right.
driven because you have shareholders who
Shareholders,
demand
yeah,
right now, or the private equity, which says, we need to improve these things. So I think it's just they're not educated in
yeah.
those type of things. With that said, there's some privately owned, family owned businesses that are run wonderfully. So I don't want to paint with too broad a brush.
But I think that's an important opportunity for many companies to come in and fundamentally change the profile of the business to kind of create more value both for the customers. I think what's forgotten in this process is, yes, the private equity investors made out well as the employees, but the aftermarket business, aftermarket processes and operation that you put into place for the continuity of touch points, relationships, the customer care really is actually about helping your customers operate better, right? So at some point, you have to realize that this is about the customer being better off as well in the bargain.
It really is. That's a very true statement. I should have emphasized that more. You're not just doing it because you want to make more money.
Right.
But if you sell equipment and you walk away, you're missing the opportunity to keep your customer happy. He may
Yeah.
be happy the day he bought it, but what's the frustration if he doesn't know when to change something out and then
Yeah.
it fails 5 years later? Now, it's well past the warranty. It's not your fault because he didn't maintain it correctly. But is he going to think about your pump or your mixer in again when he says, "Ah,
That's
it
right.
was great for the
That's
first
right.
5 years, but then it fell
That's
apart."
right. That's
Well,
right.
so if you really want to make customers, you want to talk about solution selling,
Yeah.
and part of that solution is providing them with all the knowledge to have the most effective piece of equipment operating today, tomorrow. We had equipment out for 30 years. Those customers thought the world of our products.
That's right. That's
And
right.
part of the reason it was working for 30 years is it was maintained correctly.
Maintained well. Yeah.
And so the aftermarket's more than just, hey, how can I put some money in my pocket today? It's about improving the overall value proposition of the total company.
And it's actually interesting, right? So as I kind of wrap this thing up, we're almost at the
Yeah.
30-minute mark right now. If I were to ask you to maybe kind of step back for your 30 plus years in this business, what are your lessons learned that maybe the next generation of people around us can take as part of this learning that says, here's the three or four things I took away from my 30 years of experience?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first one I think was the lesson learned from Asia, of course, which is build those relationships internally to the company and externally. Don't look at things of what do I get from this if I give this. Think of it more of how can I help you? What do you need from me? How can I help you on your journey to the customer or to your employees? That conversational dynamic will eventually lead to things like, okay, now I understand. What you think the problems are may not be, but you've had that conversation. All of a sudden, your paradigm starts to shift. So, what my mother used to say, you've got one mouth and two ears. Listen
Yes.
twice as much as you talk.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know if I've always followed that, but I will tell you it's good advice nonetheless.
Yeah.
The second one I think is, I think that follows that is don't ask people to do things that aren't naturally to them. You're not going to create, I
Important.
don't think you can take a really effective capital equipment sales group and make them also be effective aftermarket salespeople.
Yeah.
It's not the DNA.
Yeah.
So learn that that's not going to happen and create a structure where that separate organization that can happen. Yet making people do what you want simply because you want it is maybe it worked in the 40s and the 50s.
Right.
I had a boss once. If anyone from my old company, Paul Krovish, knows this, they'll know who I'm talking about. He ripped the phone out and threw it out of a window. He was mad. You can't get away with that
You
today.
can't do that.
Right. And what I find today is that CEOs and leaders in an organization, sales, whatever, are less about telling people what to do, but making sure that collectively we know what needs to get done and then facilitating how to help them do that job. I tell you, I've tried making people do what I want to do. And from my family to my children, it just doesn't work. So
Yeah.
it's much more that cooperative and that's consultative type of
Yeah.
approach, I think is the way you get people to succeed.
That's amazing. I think this has been a fantastic thing. So I always like to end these interviews or these discussions, John, with my favorite question, right? I'm a big podcast listener. I love Guy
Yeah.
Raz and his how I build his stories. He always asks at the end, I like to ask the same, if you think back to your career and where you are today, how much of it is luck versus how much of it is because of your own brilliance and, charm and good looks, right?
Well, the charm and good looks, I think your listeners will obviously understand that that's not it. I would say luck is probably 75%. I was very fortunate to have some wonderful bosses, people who really taught me what it means to be a boss, and that means not throwing phones out windows. But it really was about listening to me and understanding. When they would ask a question, so where do you want to be in 5 years? That type of. They weren't just asking this to get for a pat answer. They were like, okay, how do I help you get there? And so I had great mentors along the way. I had great opportunities, but I also took advantage of the opportunity. So the luck is getting an opportunity. The smart is taking it.
Right. Right.
So opportunities to move to Japan or move to Singapore or to run different divisions. I may not have been the first person they asked. I can't
Right.
say that's true, but you may have had someone who said, "No, I don't want to move to Japan. What are you,
Right.
crazy?" I was crazy enough to say, "Yes, I want to move to Japan." I met my wife there and raised my kids there for many years, and it was by far one of the best experiences in my life. And so, do things that make you uncomfortable. Try the things you don't know how to do. Understand that no one knows all the answers to everything all the time. My goodness, and so it's okay not to be to know. It's okay to ask for help.
Ask questions. Yeah.
And typically, what I used to tell people is, if I'm the smartest person in the room, I'm in the wrong room. So I want to be in a meeting where I hire
Yeah.
people and I work with people who know much more than I do.
Yeah.
That's really the signs typically of good managers. So 75% luck, 25% smart enough to know that I'm lucky.
That's brilliant. That's a great answer. And I love that answer. And that's actually really consistent with many of the other people I've talked to, a very similar mindset, which is there's a lot of things that happen that bring you to a certain place, but then what you do with it is something that's up to you. But in more cases than not, John, they've said the same thing which you did, which is they've been lucky to have been in certain jobs around certain people in the early days, which gave them a boost,
Mhm.
and they made took advantage of the opportunity. So
Right.
that's a great way to end this conversation, John. I really appreciate you taking the time today. I know in retirement you're busier than ever, so I appreciate you taking a few minutes today to chat with us. Thank you very much, and I'm sure we'll get a lot of feedback on this when listeners uh, take the time and listen to this in the next few weeks. So thank you, John, and have a great day.
My pleasure. Thanks again. Great seeing you.
Thank you.